Drive the length of Mississippi, one of the most overlooked states in the entire United States of America, from north to south, and the land will tell you everything you need to know before a single word of history is spoken. Start in the hill country above Oxford. Red clay ridges rise and fall like the land can't quite make up its mind. Dense hardwood forest crowds the road on both sides. The hollows between the ridges run so deep that morning light barely reaches the bottom. Communities up here grew up isolated, close enough to hear each other's church bells, too far apart to share much else. Drop south and everything changes. The hills dissolve. The land flattens so completely it feels like the earth forgot to finish itself. You've entered the Delta now, a vast, dark-soiled floodplain stretching from Memphis down to Vicksburg. Cotton fields run to every horizon. The sky doubles in size because there is nothing left to interrupt it. The towns get smaller. The distances between them get longer. The silence gets louder. Keep driving south and the ground softens beneath you. The trees change. Spanish moss. Cypress knees pushing up through standing water. The soil stops being solid and starts being suggested. Hit the Gulf Coast and salt air replaces everything, barrier islands visible in the distance, shrimp boats working the horizon, water bleeding into the sky. 3 completely different landscapes. 3 completely different ways of life. 1 state border holding all of it together. Mississippi is the 9th smallest state in America by population. But inside its borders, it contains geographic, economic, and cultural distances that most countries couldn't cover in a lifetime. And none of that, not the ridges, not the delta, not the Gulf, is even the strange part. The strange part is what this land was built. And what it buried. Here is what nobody tells you about Mississippi. This is the poorest state in the United States of America. It has ranked last in income, last in education, and last in health outcomes for decades running. If you look at the data, just the raw numbers, Mississippi looks like a place that history forgot. A place that progressed past on its way somewhere else. But here is what those numbers never tell you. Mississippi gave the world the blues. It gave America rock and roll. It gave the planet jazz in its rawest, most unfiltered form, born in the juke joints of the Delta, played by men who had nothing but a guitar and a story too heavy to speak out loud. 3 of the most commercially valuable music genres in human history. All of them rooted in the same dark Delta soil that the poverty statistics describe as a failure. The poorest state in America produced its most valuable cultural export. And it does not stop there. Mississippi sits on some of the richest agricultural land in the entire world. The Delta soil is so fertile that farming corporations from across the globe have spent decades trying to own it. And yet the people who have lived on that land for generations, the people whose ancestors built the entire economy of the American South with their bare hands, remain among the poorest in the country. Wealth in the ground. Poverty above it. Music that moved the world. Communities that the world moved on from. A state that produced more American cultural identity than almost any other, and received less credit, less investment, and less attention than almost all of them. That is the Mississippi contradiction. And it all starts with one river that drew a line through this land before anyone arrived to argue about it. That line is the Mississippi River. It runs along the entire western border of the state, 545 miles of the most powerful, most unpredictable waterway in North America. But the river is not just a border. It is a fault line. And everything that makes Mississippi a contradiction can be traced back to what the river deposited on one side of it and withheld from the other. On the western edge of the state, pressed tight against the river, sits the delta. This is not a delta in the geographic sense, no river mouth, no fan of sediment spreading into open water. This is a flat, elongated floodplain roughly 200 miles long and 70 miles wide, built over millions of years by the Mississippi River flooding its banks and leaving behind some of the deepest, darkest, most fertile topsoil on the surface of the earth. The delta soil can grow almost anything. Cotton especially. And cotton is exactly what it grew, for 2 centuries, on the backs of enslaved people, then sharecroppers, in conditions that changed in name far more than they changed in reality. The Delta built extraordinary wealth. It built it for a very small number of people. And it kept the vast majority of the people doing the actual work in a poverty so structural, so deliberately maintained, that it outlasted the plantation system that created it. East of the Delta, the land rises into the hills. A different geology. A different economy. Smaller farms. Less cotton. Different crops. Communities that look toward Tennessee and Alabama rather than toward the river and New Orleans. Same state. Same border. 2 completely different worlds staring at each other across a distance that has nothing to do with miles. The river built both. It fed one. And it has been pulling the other apart, slowly, ever since. Mississippi became a state in 1817. But the conditions that locked in its contradictions were set decades earlier, and they were set deliberately. The land was designed to be 2 things at once. A territory of extraordinary agricultural potential. And a system of total human exploitation engineered to extract that potential at the lowest possible cost. From the very beginning, Mississippi was not built to distribute its wealth. It was built to concentrate it. The plantation system was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate economic architecture, written into law, enforced by violence, and protected by every political institution the state possessed. By 1860, Mississippi was the wealthiest state in the United States of America per capita. The cotton economy had made its planter class richer than almost anyone in the country. And enslaved people, who made up more than half the state's entire population, owned none of it. Not a single acre. Not a single dollar. Not a single legal right. The founding contradiction was this: Mississippi built one of the most productive economies in American history using a workforce it refused to recognize as human. And when that workforce was legally freed in 1865, the state did not dismantle the system. It renamed it. Sharecropping replaced slavery in practice if not in name. Black Mississippians who had worked the land for generations found themselves legally free and economically trapped, indebted to the same landowners, working the same fields, living in the same conditions, with a different word on the paperwork. The wealth stayed where it had always been. The poverty stayed where it had always been. And the music, the blues, born directly from that specific pain, in that specific place, at that specific moment in history, began to rise from the Delta like heat off the summer fields. Before we go any further, and we are about to go much further, I want to pause here for a moment. Because what you are watching right now is not a video about poverty statistics. It is not a video about cotton or slavery or sharecropping as distant historical facts. It is a video about how a place gets shaped, how geography and economics and deliberate human decisions layer on top of each other over generations until the contradictions become so deep, so structural, so woven into the landscape itself, that they stop looking like contradictions at all. They just start looking like the way things are. Mississippi is not an exception to America. Mississippi is America, compressed, concentrated, and impossible to look away from once you understand what you are actually seeing. Every state in this country carries some version of this story. Wealth built on land that was taken. Labor extracted from people who were excluded from its rewards. A founding promise and a founding betrayal living side by side, close enough to touch. Mississippi just never learned to hide it as well as the others did. And that is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. If you want to understand how geography shapes the way Americans live, how a river, a soil type, or a state border can determine whether a community prospers or collapses across generations, then this channel is built for you. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because every state in this country has a fault line running through it. And we are going to find every single one of them. Now, back to Mississippi. Because we have reached the moment when everything the state had been building toward, every contradiction, every buried tension, every deferred reckoning, finally exploded. And it happened on a bridge. March 7, 1965. Edmund Pettus Bridge. Selma, Alabama sits just across the state line, but the people on that bridge were Mississippi's children. 600 marchers. Heading toward Montgomery. Demanding the right to vote that the United States Constitution had technically guaranteed them for nearly a century, and that Mississippi, Alabama, and the entire apparatus of the Jim Crow South had spent that same century systematically destroying. They made it to the crest of the bridge. And then the state troopers were waiting. What happened next was broadcast on national television. Clubs. Tear gas. Horses driven into the crowd. John Lewis, 25 years old, skull fractured, left on the pavement. The images went around the world within hours. And the world could not look away. But here is what the television cameras did not show. The machinery that made that bridge necessary had been built and maintained in Mississippi longer, more thoroughly, and more violently than almost anywhere else in the American South. Mississippi had the highest number of lynchings of any state in the country between 1877 and 1950. It had the most sophisticated system of voter suppression, literacy tests designed to fail, poll taxes calculated to exclude, registrars who simply refused, and a Klan infrastructure that made the consequences of trying perfectly clear. Medgar Evers. Emmett Till. The 3 civil rights workers murdered in Neshoba County in 1964, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. Mississippi did not just resist the civil rights movement. It declared war on it. And yet, the same state that produced that violence also produced Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper's daughter from Sunflower County who stood before the 1964 Democratic National Convention and told the truth about Mississippi so plainly, so powerfully, that President Johnson interrupted the broadcast to keep America from hearing it live. The contradiction held. Right to the end. Here is Mississippi today. It is still the poorest state in the United States of America. Median household income sits around $46,000, the lowest of any state in the country, nearly $30,000 below Massachusetts. The child poverty rate hovers above 27%. Life expectancy is the shortest in the nation. The healthcare infrastructure in the Delta, the same Delta that built one of the wealthiest economies in 19th century America, is so thin that some counties have no hospital within reasonable driving distance. The contradictions did not soften with time. They sharpened. Drive from the Gulf Coast into the Delta today and you will cross the same fault line that has always been there, only now it is measured in broadband access and hospital beds instead of cotton yields and plantation acreage. The geography changed its vocabulary. The divide stayed exactly where the river put it. And yet, Mississippi's music industry generates billions. The blues tourism economy alone draws visitors from Europe, Japan, and Australia to small delta towns that the state's own investment strategies have largely abandoned. People fly across the world to stand in Clarksdale, one of the poorest cities in the poorest state in America, because the culture that was born from that specific suffering is considered among the most important artistic inheritances in human history. The state that the country treats as its economic footnote is the cultural foundation that the country's entire popular music tradition is built on. Elvis Presley was from Mississippi. Muddy Waters was from Mississippi. Bo Diddley. Robert Johnson. B.B. King. Jimmy Rogers. The list does not end. the poorest state in America produced the soundtrack that the richest country in the world has been playing ever since. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story. And Mississippi still has not received credit for it. But here is what nobody is talking about. The Mississippi River, the same river that built the Delta, deposited its soil, defined its economy, and drew the fault line that everything else in this state runs along, is now threatening to abandon it entirely. For decades, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been fighting a geological battle that many scientists believe is already lost. The old river control structure, a massive complex of dams, locks, and spillways sitting at the point where the Mississippi meets the Atchafalaya River in Louisiana, is the only thing preventing the Mississippi River from permanently changing course. Without it, the river would redirect itself entirely into the Atchafalaya Basin. The delta would be cut off from its water source. The port of New Orleans would lose its river. And the entire agricultural and economic infrastructure built along the lower Mississippi over 3 centuries would be left sitting next to a river that no longer runs there. The Corps has been holding that structure together since 1963. Engineers describe it as one of the most consequential pieces of infrastructure in the United States. Some describe it as a structure the river will eventually win against. And that is before the sea level rise projections. The Gulf Coast of Mississippi, already devastated by Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which killed 238 people in the state and destroyed entire coastal communities, faces some of the most aggressive coastal erosion projections in the country. Hancock County, Harrison County, Jackson County. Entire stretches of coastline that communities have lived on for generations are being recalculated as temporary. The land that made Mississippi what it is, the river, the delta, the Gulf, is all moving. And the communities least equipped to absorb that loss are precisely the ones the land built, exploited, and never adequately compensated for. The geography that created the contradiction is now deepening it. Drive the length of Mississippi one more time. Start again in the hill country above Oxford. The red clay ridges. The hardwood hollows where morning light arrives late and leaves early. The small communities that grew up close enough to hear each other but far enough apart to stay separate. Nothing about this landscape announces itself. Nothing here asks to be noticed. Drop south into the delta. The land flattens. The sky expands. The soil turns dark and impossibly rich, the same soil that built a fortune for a few and a trap for everyone else. The same soil that a sharecropper's son sat on with a guitar and turned for centuries of pain into the most influential music the modern world has ever heard. Hit the Gulf Coast. Salt air. The barrier islands in the distance. The water that Katrina crossed in 2005 and has been creeping back toward ever since. 3 worlds. 1 border. 1 river running along the edge of all of it, slowly deciding whether to stay. Mississippi is not the opposite of every American state because it failed. Every state that calls itself successful built something on the same foundation Mississippi built on: extracted labor, concentrated wealth, deferred justice. Mississippi is simply the state where the foundation was never successfully hidden. Where the contradiction was never successfully papered over. Where the distance between what America promised and what America delivered has always been too short to misread. It is not a broken state. It is an honest one. The poorest state in America. The cultural foundation of American music. The most fertile soil on the continent. The deepest poverty. The loudest silence. The most overlooked place in a country that has built its entire popular identity on what Mississippi created. Every American contradiction. Compressed into one river valley. And still playing. Mississippi did not end when this video did. The river is still running. The delta is still there, still producing, still struggling, still sitting on the richest soil in the country while the people who live on it fight for basic infrastructure. The Gulf Coast is still measuring how much ground it lost last year and calculating how much it will lose next. The music is still playing in Clarksdale on a Friday night, in a juke joint that looks like it has no business still standing, filled with people who have every reason to have stopped singing a long time ago. And none of it, not the poverty, not the music, not the river, not the soil, exists in isolation. Every single element of the Mississippi story connects directly to a larger American story. The Delta connects to the plantation economy that shaped Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. The voter suppression connects to the political architecture that Tennessee and Virginia built and maintained for just as long. The cultural erasure connects to the pattern that Louisiana, Kentucky, and Maryland all know by a different name. Every state in this country has a fault line. A river that drew a line. A founding document that promised two things at once. A community that built wealth and a system that ensured they never owned it. We are going to find every single one of them. If this video changed how you see Mississippi, how you see America, share it with someone who needs to see it too. The algorithm responds to watch time, to comments, to shares. Every one of those things tells the platform that this kind of story deserves a wider audience. Comment below, which state should we go to next? And if you have not already subscribed, you already know you should. The next fault line is waiting.